Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on criminal causation to a scenario. Up to now we've been looking at evaluation essays and how to write those, and in our last topic, omissions, we looked at an evaluation essay where you had to talk about whether the law on omissions was good or bad, and that's the skill for exam 3. But what we're looking at today is a scenario which is on exam 2, and a scenario, I've got an example here on this slide, is basically a little story, a made-up story, a series of events that you need to read, and then you need to advise the characters on what crimes and possibly what defences might apply. So when we're looking at scenarios, we're actually doing the job of a barrister or a solicitor in that we're looking at a situation in order to advise our client. In this tutorial, we're going to be concentrating on causation, but this technique that I'm going to show you today, you can apply to any area of law. Okay, so criminal law, tort, contract, doesn't matter. We're going to use the same framework for getting a nice answer to a scenario that you can use regardless of what the topic of the scenario is. But obviously today our topic is causation because that's what we've just been studying. So let's start by just reading through this scenario and looking at what we're actually being asked. So the situation is this. Charlotte stabbed Sarah in the stomach. Sarah had a pre-existing blood clotting problem, which meant that she lost lots of blood. Sarah hated hospitals, so she failed to ring an ambulance immediately. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were so panicked by the amount of blood loss that they made a mistake and gave her too much oxygen. Sarah went into a coma. At hospital, Sarah was put on life support, but this was withdrawn a week later when it was no longer in her best interests. Sarah died. And you're being asked to explain whether causation can be proven in order to find Charlotte liable for Sarah's death. So this is our scenario and this is our question, and it'll always be worth 25 marks in the exam. Our defendant here is Charlotte and our victim is Sarah, and you're being asked to advise whether Charlotte's liable for Sarah's death. Now, in order to get a good answer to that question, we always want to follow the same structure. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the idea structure that we always use for any scenario on exam 2. The structure that we use is called idea, and each letter in the word idea stands for the steps that we need to take in order to get a good answer to a scenario question. So firstly, we identify the offence or the crime that our defendant, that's what D stands for, might have committed. We then D, define the crime or the issue in the question. We then E, explain the law with cases. And then we A, apply the law to the scenario. And if you follow these steps in order, you should get a really nice answer to the question and you're going to maximise your chances of picking up the 25 marks. Now, on a scenario question, you get 10 marks for your AO1. That means for your knowledge of the law, for your knowledge of the definitions, the cases, the principles, the rules. But you get 15 marks for your AO2, which is your application. And that's applying that knowledge to the scenario, to the story that you've got in front of you. So although it's really important to know your law, you are picking up most of the marks for your application. So by following this structure, I'm helping you to get the best possible answer to the question. So this looks a bit hypothetical here, this IDEA. What I've done on my next slide is used this IDEA in relation to causation. So I've broken down exactly what you would put in your I, your D, your E and your A on a causation scenario. And I'll go through that with you now. So we identify what the issue is in the scenario. So you're going to start off with something like, in order for the defendant, and you're going to use your defendant's name from the scenario. So in our Charlotte and Sarah one, we would be saying, in order for Charlotte to be liable for the victim's death, and again, you want to use the victim's name from the scenario. So in order for Charlotte to be liable for Sarah's death, causation must be proven. So it's only a sentence, but it is identifying what the issue is in the scenario. And then you define the issue that you've said it is. So we've said it's all about causation, so then we define what causation is. So causation is proving that the defendant caused the consequence. Factual and legal causation must be proven. So your D, again, is short. Okay, that is your definition of what you've identified. We then need to explain with cases what we've just defined. And I've used some different colours here just to try and make it a bit clearer for you. So I now need to explain all of the rules on causation. And basically your E, you should be writing out what's in your booklet. So you're going through all of the rules on causation in exactly the same order that we went through them in class. So you're going to explain factual causation using White and Paget. Sorry, there's a spelling mistake there. So you're going to say, firstly, we need to prove factual causation using the but-for test. It wasn't met in White because she would have died anyway, but it was met in Paget because she wouldn't have died but for being used as a human shield. We then explain de minimis using Kimsey. So we say the next step is the de minimis rule, where minimal causes may be discounted. Kimsey says there must be more than a slight or trifling link. We then go on to thin skull using Blau, that you've got to take your victim as you find them. So if they've got anything unusual about them that makes them more vulnerable, that's just tough on the defendant. They have to accept that. You're then going to explain novus actus interveniens by a third party. So you'd be talking about all of the doctor cases, so Smith, Cheshire, Malsharek, Jordan, explain all of those principles. Then explain victim's own act. So it won't break the chain if reasonable, Roberts. It will break it if daft, Williams. And then explain natural but unpredictable events such as lightning will break the chain. So you can see here your E is going to be quite long and you are just basically copying out the booklet. But obviously in the exam, you're doing all of that from memory. Once you've explained, we then go on to our final step in IDEA. So remember it's IDEA and the A stands for apply. And this is where you're going to be picking up your 15 AO2 marks. So your explain is almost like a checklist for what you're going to apply. And you can see here that I've used different colours to try and make it obvious to you that I'm going to apply the green rule, and then going to apply the purple rule, and then going to apply the blue rule. So my explanation is a checklist of all of the rules I now need to apply to my characters. So you look back at your scenario at this point and say, and we'd be saying in our case, it's Charlotte. Charlotte meets the but-for test for factual causation because Sarah never would have died but for Charlotte stabbing her in the stomach. Then move on to de minimis. So Charlotte meets the de minimis rule because stabbing Sarah in the stomach was more than a slight or trifling link. You'd then go on to Blau, talking about or applying Blau. So you'd say, in this particular case, Sarah does have a pre-existing blood clotting problem, which has made her more vulnerable, but Charlotte isn't going to be able to blame this on Sarah and say that that's the true cause of death, because she's got to take Sarah as she finds her, following Blau. Then you need to apply whether a medic has broken the chain. So if we go back to the Charlotte situation, you can see here that the paramedics made a mistake. And hopefully you're thinking of the cases when you're reading the scenarios. They always use facts that hopefully are going to make you think, oh, it's a bit like Jordan, or oh, it's a bit like Cheshire. And that's giving you a clue as to your application. So when I'm applying the law there, whether the medical people have broken the chain, I'd be saying they did make a mistake, but it's not as bad as Jordan because it's only happened once. It's not palpably wrong. We're going to follow the general rule from Smith and Cheshire. You'd then go through and talk about whether the victim has potentially broken the chain themselves. Were they reasonable or daft? And again, if we just go back to our scenario, it says something like Sarah hated hospitals as she failed to ring an ambulance. So Charlotte might say, well, it's Sarah's own fault. Sarah's broken the chain by not calling the ambulance. But people are frightened of hospitals, and it's almost a bit like take your victim as you find them. She's not daft, she's acting in shock, so her actions were reasonable given the situation. It's not going to break the chain. And apply whether there's been a natural but unpredictable event, and there hasn't been in our scenario. And then you're going to conclude whether your defendant is the cause of death. Now, on my next slide, I've actually written out, and it's very short and bullet pointy, so I could fit it on one slide, but I've written out an answer to the Charlotte scenario. So you might actually want to pause the video here so you can have a read of this and you can see how I've gone through that idea structure. And you can see I've used colours again here to make things clearer. Wherever I've done application, I've used blue font. And wherever I've just explained the law, I've done black font. So the blue is my AO2 and the black is my AO1. And I've put the cases in green so that they stand out as well. Okay, so I've identified Charlotte might be liable for Sarah's death. I've defined what causation is. I've explained causation, going through all the rules with my cases. Remember, you'll be writing in full sentences. I'm writing much more than me. This is just so you can see what content would go in. And then I've applied it. So but for is met as Sarah, that's what S stands for, wouldn't have died but for the stabbing. Charlotte's more than a slight or trifling link. Sarah has a pre-existing condition, but Charlotte's got to take her as she finds her. Paramedics have given too much oxygen, but it's probably not palpably wrong. The doctors switched off the life support at the end of the scenario. So if we just go back there, a week later, life support's withdrawn. But remember, if we apply the law Malsharek, that's not going to break the chain. As I said before, Sarah doesn't call an ambulance, but that's not going to break the chain. And in conclusion, it looks like Charlotte's going to be liable for Sarah's death because the chain of causation is intact. As I say, this is very listy, just so you can see the order of what I've gone through. You would be writing in full sentences. And it's really good practice as well to compare your scenario to a case. So when I'm saying paramedics have given too much oxygen, but this is not palpably wrong, if I was writing out the essay, I'd be saying, because in the case of Jordan, it was two separate things. It was the drug she was allergic to twice and the extra fluids, whereas here it's just one single issue. So always compare your situation to the cases, because then you're going to be picking up lots of AO2 marks. So I hope that's been helpful in looking at what a scenario is. So a scenario is a story that we're advising our clients on. And in order to get a good answer, you are always going to use the idea structure. You identify what the issue is, you define the issue, you explain the issue using all of your cases that you've memorized, and then you apply all of those rules and cases to the scenario that you've been given. And that way, you should get a really nice answer to the question. So have a go at doing that and see if you can get a nice answer to another scenario from your booklets.